Crush it with Maizex canola. Maizex Seeds is 100% focused on Canadian farmers. Your source for high-performance grain, silage, and grazing corn, as well as soybeans and, new for 2026, canola. Visit Maizex.com to find your local Maizex representative.
It's time for RealAg Radio on Rural Radio Channel 147 on Sirius XM. RealAg Radio and RealAgriculture.com is your home for insight and analysis of the issues that are impacting your farm business. Let's get real and get connected with RealAg Radio. Welcome to RealAg Radio here on Rural Radio 147, Sirius XM. Shaun Haney, your host here on this Wednesday, midweek edition of the show. Thanks so much, everybody, for making RealAg Radio and Rural Radio 147 a big part of your workday as well. Big shout out to everybody listening out there on the RealAg Radio podcast. And today we got a special treat for you. Lots happening with China. You know this. Pork products, aquaculture, peas are in the middle of this now as well, on top of canola. And wanted to get some insight into really what's top of mind in China. A lot happening economically, of course, politically as well. And today we've had him on the show before, and we're bringing him back. It is the director of the China Institute at the University of Alberta. It is Philippe Rheault will be with us here today. And he is one of Canada's foremost experts when it comes to China. Looking forward to having a chat with him. We're going to talk about, is it as simple as just removing those EV tariffs for Canada to be able to get rid of these tariffs on some of these ag products? And where does the U.S. fit into this equation as well? So there's a lot happening in this triangular sort of negotiation. What is Canada to do? What is the U.S. to do? And what is China's strategy? So lots to chat about here. Heavy conversation and trying to provide some insight for you out there in the Real Agriculture audience. We're also today going to have a product spotlight with Proven Seed. Jennifer Dale will be with us to talk about some of the things that they have going on here for fall as we're really into seed selection time for the 2026 season. So we'll get some insights from Jennifer today on the program in a product spotlight. Now, if you have any feedback on today's show, we'd love to hear from you. Send me an email, shaney@realagriculture.com. Or, of course, you can call that Real Ag feedback line, 855-776-6147. Let's take a break. When we come back, we've got the director of the China Institute, the University of Alberta, right after this.
Anniversaries are a time of reflection, celebration, and connection. 10 years ago, G3 set out with a vision to build something better for Canadian grain farmers. And you joined us on that journey to launch a new national network. Thank you for the relationships that made it possible. A decade of growth, a decade of connections, and more in decades to come. Connect with your farm business representative or find your closest elevator at g3smarter.ca.
Is your family farm's future uncertain? Silence might be the biggest risk of all. Discover how open conversations and gradual planning can secure your legacy and empower the next generation. Don't wait. Start the dialogue today. Learn more and download a transition planning checklist, your guide to farm succession planning at fcc.ca/knowledge.
At Proven Seed, we know that farming in Western Canada doesn't just teach us, it shapes us. Here we face challenges with resilience, innovation, and grit born from decades of experience. We battle the conditions again and again because growing crops here isn't just what we do, it's who we are. We're raised to adapt just like you, with varieties grown specifically for your local conditions. Visit provenseed.ca/raised to adapt to hear our story.
From nutrient management to the latest weather, market, and ag trends, The Dirt, an economics podcast, is your place for farm-smart topics to boost your profitability. Join host Mike Howell on Season 4 of The Dirt podcast, available now at nutrient-economics.com. Okay, Lots happening right now in the world of geopolitics. And when you look at all the different puzzle pieces and the arrangement of them, a lot of it works back to what's happening right now in regards to policy in China. Here to talk about, China and shed some light on how it impacts North America, Canada, and the U.S. We're talking to the director of the China Institute, the University of Alberta. It is Philippe Rheault. Philippe, it is great to chat with you.
Shaun, it's great to be back. I really enjoyed our chat last time, so it's nice to be back again.
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess we could start narrow and kind of broaden it a little bit. I guess we shouldn't go too far without talking about China is in a, I guess we could call it trade where there's things going on with the U.S., but there's also things in particular to Canada. Right now we have tariffs on canola oil, canola meal, canola seed, pork. We also have some pulse products that are impacted, as well as aquaculture. Yeah. What exactly is at work here? Does this all come back to those EV tariffs that everyone's talking about?
That's a good question. Maybe I'll start my answer by saying something that sounds a little bit counterintuitive given everything you just put forth there. But my personal sense is actually China is not looking for a fight with Canada right now.
Interesting.
Yeah. In fact, if anything, they see opportunity everywhere, including vis-a-vis the relations with Canada and also in Europe and other parts of the world as a function of U.S. behavior in recent months. And we can unpack that a little bit more later. But to kind of get to the crux of your question, I do think that a lot of the current kind of trade policy actions that China is taking vis-a-vis Canada is actually directly in response to the Canadian government's decision to impose 100% duties on electric vehicles about a year ago, right? So yeah, to oversimplify, I think from their perspective, this is not about looking for a fight. It's more about retaliation, right? And if I might add, maybe anticipating your next question, I think that retaliate the why they see it that way is partly because of the way that Canada imposed those duties in the first place, right? Canada has always been positioning itself as a champion of international trade rules, as a country that believes in process, that reverts to the WTO or other mechanisms when it comes to figuring out trade remedies. But in the case of the EV tariffs, Canada took a much more cavalier and arguably a blunt approach, and basically the subtext was they wanted to signal to the United States at the time. It was still Biden administration, but with a Trump administration perhaps, or Biden anyway, an increasingly protectionistic America, the Canadian government at the time, the Trudeau government, wanted to signal to the U.S. that we were all in on Fortress North America by aligning our EV tariffs with theirs without even pretending to go through a process, right?
I had one industry person tell me that it's kind of odd that China is more WTO compliant than Canada is on this issue. So that fits what you just said. Do you think it's as simple as Canada just removing those EV tariffs and China responds and removes the tariffs they've applied on this country?
Well, everyone's going to try to couch their actions in all sorts of justificatory rhetoric, but I think the Chinese have pretty much said as much. So yeah, I think if we can find a workable approach to the EV situation, then we actually could see some rather rapid progress on canola. I think, maybe to frame it and to put it in a broader context again, so we're already talking about the connection between EVs and canola. I think, if you were willing to accept my premise that the Chinese are not really looking for a fight here, they're actually looking for some type of resolution. I would say the following though, which is I think what they're trying to do as well is to try to signal to the Carney government that the Canadian government will not have the luxury of dealing with the United States and China in sequence, right? They're going to be forcing Canada to deal with China and the United States at the same time in real time, right? Forcing a triangulation between the three, right? I think from in an ideal world, this is still a fairly young, new Carney government, but in an ideal world, I think that they were hoping that they could do the following, which is A, get elected, B, quickly signal to the Chinese that there was going to be a new approach to Canada-China relations, perhaps a more pragmatic one, still robust. I think Prime Minister Carney has been clear, mindful of Canadian interests, ensuring that the Canadian resiliency and protecting us from certain vulnerabilities, but certainly a more pragmatic approach with China, and that approach was going to be come down the line. So we had, in quick succession after the election of the Carney government, we had phone calls between the trade and foreign ministers, meetings at the ministerial level, and then a phone call between Prime Minister Carney and Premier Li Qiang of China, the number two there, but the guy who was in charge of the trade files, at least ostensibly. And that phone call between the two leaders was very positive, right, and set the stage for progress. But then, in the minds of the Prime Minister's office, certainly the hope was, okay, we've signaled to the Chinese that we're going to repair this relationship, but now let's turn to the Americans and deal with that first, right? And once we've solved that, we can turn to China. The problem is it's taking longer than I think anyone would have hoped to come to a deal with the Americans. And the longer that drags on, then the more you're going to be forced to look at China at the same time. And I think this is the Chinese signaling, look, you don't have the luxury of waiting anymore. You're going to have to deal with us at the same time as you deal with Washington. And that, of course, is a challenge because China might be our second largest trading partner. But we export 20 times more to the United States than we do to China. So anytime we look at possible overtures vis-a-vis Beijing, we have to calculate or try to calculate what that impact might be on our relationship with Washington in what remains a very unpredictable Canada-U.S. bilateral context. Yeah.
Now, some geopolitical experts that I've talked to talk about this multipolar world, that Canada might not be afforded the luxury of being as Canadian as they have been in the past, where you're friends with everybody. And they're going to have to choose between the U.S. or China. Is that something that you buy into, or what's your reaction to that?
I don't. If we're going to lose the luxury of something, I think it's going to be losing the luxury of relying on anyone overly relying on anyone, including the Americans. I mean, unfortunately, I think we're in a new paradigm now where even the Americans are less predictable and possibly less reliable than the past. It doesn't mean that they're not going to be our partners in many areas, but I think what it means is that Canada now needs to be more proactive in terms of defining its interests and carving out its space internationally, as opposed to reacting. So even by choosing who you're going to be friends with, right, or trying to be, generally we've been reacting to events. I think now we actually have to take a close look at how we can double down on creating resiliency and leverage for Canada vis-a-vis all partners, right? Yeah.
There was an article in the Wall Street Journal over the weekend talking about how China is talking to the Americans, but not that interested in coming to a conclusion of a deal. I asked that question in reference to this discussion because of this triangular sort of situation. How would you describe that relationship right now between the U.S. and China and their quest for some sort of an agreement?
I think uncertainty. It might be a trump card for the U.S. presidency, as it were, but it's creating challenges for everyone. So I think the Chinese, and we can try to unpack this even more later if you want, but they don't like uncertainty. They like predictability, and so faced with a U.S. that is difficult to predict, I think they're hedging, right? And so they're trying to keep the current kind of uneasy equilibrium on the trade deal, where there's some tariffs on China, but not as many as were threatened. The leverage of supplying critical minerals and other types of kind of leverage on the Chinese side, they haven't been using that as much. So there's kind of like an uneasy equilibrium right now, right? But I think what's harder to predict is how things are going to play out on the American side, because I think it's fair to say there's a lot of hawkish voices around the president. But it's not clear to me that the president himself is necessarily a China hawk, right? He's more transactional. He does have sometimes some affinity for kind of like strongman kind of management. He's shown his appreciation for that in the past, and so where does his end game lie? If he was offered, for example, a grand bargain with China that he thought was going to advance his priorities, he might be willing to take it even against the advice of his entourage and his advisors, right? That could be on Taiwan, it could be on trade, it could be on how to rearrange the global governance order, et cetera. Like, there's a lot of unknowns there with respect to how the president might react. And in the face of that, I think the Chinese are going to try to keep the relationship going, keep the conversation going, but at the same time, double down on the what I would view as the deleterious effects, right? The effects that this has, the negative effects this has on U.S. interests, right? This behavior on the part of Washington is actually creating a lot of space and opportunity for China to reach out to other countries, right? And so we saw a rather dramatic example of that over last week in Beijing. The headlines were a lot about the parade and the military parade and North Korean leader Kim Jong-un finally traveling to Beijing and hanging out with Vladimir Putin and all that. That was one part of it. But the other part of the choreography was the meetings that occurred before that were hosted as a function of this Shanghai Cooperation Organization, where Prime Minister Modi of India was there, right? And so why Modi was there in part was because he's been getting the aggressive cold shoulder from Washington. Washington has basically been pushing India into China's arms, and China, as a function of that, has been savvy enough to tone down its own conflicts with India and roll out the red carpet to try to kind of pull erstwhile U.S. partners into the Chinese orbit.
We've been talking to Philippe Rheault. He is the director of the China Institute at the University of Alberta. And we'll have more of the conversation shortly. But first, when we come back, we're going to have a product spotlight with Proven Seed and Jennifer Dale right after this.
Protect your anhydrous ammonia application earlier than normal this fall. Defend against potential losses and protect your bottom line with new Centuro A-Pro Nitrogen Stabilizer. Patented active ingredient pronitridine offers agronomically effective protection where it matters most, below ground. The new concentrated formulation lowers application rates. Start early with Centuro A-Pro as part of your nitrogen management plan. Contact your local retailer or visit centuro.ca for more information today.
The Canola School on RealAgriculture.com is a video series that showcases the latest in canola research and production agronomy. Learn from some of the best at your own pace through quick and timely producer-focused videos available on our YouTube channel. The Canola School on RealAgriculture.com is the quickest way to keep up to date on all the latest in canola production. Boost your canola IQ with the Canola School, brought to you by BASF, and visit canolaschool.com.
Built on over 100 years of seed innovation and unwavering commitment to farmers, Pioneer 100 Series canola hybrids deliver a step change in yield performance and agronomic traits. This isn't just better canola, it's different canola. Pioneer 100 Series. Contact your local Pioneer sales representative or visit pioneer.com/100 series to learn more today.
Welcome back to RealAg Radio here on Rural Radio, Channel 147, Sirius XM. It is time for today's product spotlight. And joining me now, it's Jen Dale. She's product manager with Proven Canola Seed. Jen, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Lindsay. It's always great to talk about what's new in canola.
All right. So now, Proven Seed. This is a well-known name. There's some exciting new things coming for the next season. We're going to unpack those today. But what sets Proven Seed apart in the canola market right now?
Yeah, Lindsay, their name really says it all, Proven. Before any of our hybrids reach growers, we've really been putting them through the testing. So full seasons across Western Canada with hundreds of plots. We breed and trial under real-world conditions right here in Western Canada, so different soil types, moisture levels, and disease pressures. So by the time these hybrids reach the marketplace, farmers know that they're ready for their acres. And importantly, it's all backed by the agronomic support and Nutrient's vast network of over 160 retails across Western Canada.
Now, you did mention, of course, a few of the key points that any grower is going to look for in a new hybrid. What are the top priorities for the Proven brand when you're developing these new canola hybrids?
For us, it really comes down to three things: yield, disease resistance, and the harvestability flexibility. So we put an extreme focus on breeding for clubroot, blackleg disease resistance, etc., because we know how big of a concern it is for growers. And we also recognize that the straight cut has become more and more of a priority. So our new hybrids are designed with the strong stability and pot integrity to support harvest.
That is absolutely becoming just really the most important thing come harvest, after yield, of course. Now, we are hearing quite a bit about NTech technology. What is that?
So absolutely. NTech is our pod and integrity technology. It's all about protecting yields and giving growers more control. So by reducing the risk of pod shatter, NTech helps growers delay harvest a bit if needed, but without worrying about losing any yield. So it's a peace of mind that your pods are going to hold up for whenever you need them.
Now, you also mentioned clubroot. I do want to touch on that just quickly. How is Proven approaching the problem of clubroot?
So every single one of our new hybrids carries strong multigenic clubroot resistance. So for example, the PV662, it's really well suited in that high pressure areas such as Northern Alberta. PV663 and PV664, also strong launches this year. They'll have a Mendel clubroot and still be a fit in some of those concerned areas.
All right. Now, so you did mention some of those. Give us a snapshot. What can growers dig into, look for when they're planning their seed purchases this fall, and of course, planning for the spring seeding season?
Yeah. Thanks for that, Lindsay. We have three new hybrids that we're really excited about for this 2026 season. So PV662 LCM, it's a Liberty Link multigenic clubroot. Again, ideal for those high pressure clubroot areas of Northern Alberta. Where we move into the NTech technology, the PV663 LCN combines the clubroot resistance with NTech. Again, is a great fit for any of those straight cut acres across Western Canada. And then also PV664 LCN, it's a full season option with both clubroot and blackleg resistance. Again, with that guarantee of the NTech that you know that it's going to stand for your harvest needs.
Now, there's so many things to unpack, of course, when it comes to choosing a hybrid. Farmers like to ask questions. They want to know more, maybe want to look at some of the data that, of course, Proven Seed will have for all these varieties. So where can farmers go to learn more, and who can they talk to about finding the right fit for the hybrids on their particular farms?
Yeah, so the best place to get any of the hybrid information is provenseed.ca. So that'll have all variety information, our testing information, etc. And then if they want to go talk to someone in person, any of our Nutrient Ag Solutions reps would be glad to answer any questions.
All right, that sounds fantastic. Jen, thank you so much for joining me on the show today.
Perfect. Thanks, Lindsay.
All right, we'll be back with more RealAg Radio right after this.
If you're involved in the agriculture industry, it's important to stay informed on all the latest issues affecting your business. At RealAgriculture.com, we offer fast, reliable news, information, and insights to help you keep on top of all of the latest in Canadian agriculture. Visit RealAgriculture.com and sign up for our free daily newsletter covering everything from news, agronomy, animal agriculture, and much more. Visit RealAgriculture.com/subscribe today.
The Pulse School on RealAgriculture.com has everything you need to get your crop off to a great start and a strong finish. Whether you're growing chickpeas, fava beans, lentils, or peas, you'll get all the latest and best agronomic information at PulseSchool.com. A library of top-notch agronomy videos from industry experts available on demand at your fingertips. Visit the Pulse School, brought to you by BASF on RealAgriculture.com.
Dairy producers are wanted for the first American Dairy Expo. It's happening November 5th and 6th at the Champlain Valley Exposition in Vermont. Grab a free breakfast, tour the 200 Company Dairy Innovation Trade Show, meet Olympian and dairy producer Elle St. Pierre, and take in the Dairy Delivers Classroom. Full details, discount coupon, and pre-expo tickets are available at AmericanDairyExpo.com. Let's continue the conversation with Philippe Rheault, who's the director of the China Institute at the U of A. We've seen a lot of, from an agricultural export standpoint, there's been a lot of greater alignment from China with Brazil and Argentina. What is in that for China? Can you because from an American standpoint, they look, U.S. hasn't bought any U.S. soybeans this fall. That's a big problem for the American farmer. We obviously have concerns about shipping meat products out of Canada as well as canola. What's the strategy on aligning with South America?
Well, I mean, if you're in a global dynamic where there's a increasing rivalry, competition, and in some cases antagonism between the two main powers, then it's both of them are going to be trying to hedge that by reducing the reliance on each other for various critical inputs, right? And when it comes to food security, arguably the Chinese are more vulnerable than the Americans. And so if they can secure critical supplies from non-American partners, well, that's going to be a desirable thing from their perspective, just in terms of national security. It also creates more fabric, more traction with respect to the China-Brazil, for example, in this case, bilateral diplomatic relationship, which means that, again, trying to pull a big, important South American country away from the U.S. orbit and into the Chinese one. Arguably, again, the Trump administration is actually facilitating that move by its policy towards Brazil over the last little while, right? So I think it's partly driven by security and hedging on critical inputs, but it's also it's a diplomatic opportunity by enhancing trade with partners that otherwise would be working with the U.S. And thirdly, I guess you could also argue it actually provides additional leverage to China vis-a-vis the United States in terms of being able to then brandish the possibility or the lure of increased agricultural purchases from the United States in the future as part of an eventual deal.
So what is Prime Minister Carney to do? We have a number of U.S. farm groups that are encouraging the Prime Minister to go to Beijing, and I'm paraphrasing, but hey, this is a political problem. It requires political solutions. What if the Prime Minister called you this afternoon and said, "Okay, Philip, what do I do?" Do you suggest that he go?
I think it's a bit early for that, but I think at some point that might be desirable. But I think there's some homework to be done first domestically. I think in the past, Canadian government in the last few years has tended to be a bit more reactive than proactive when it comes to China. We react to what they want. We react to what they do. We're not that good at telling the Chinese government what it is that we want, what it is that we don't like. So I think, given that this government is still a bit young, there's probably an opportunity to, come up with a China strategy. Might be a bit too grand an advice, but maybe come up with a small number of first principles that should govern our relationship with China, right? For example, maybe prioritize re-engagement with China in areas that actually provide optionality for Canada vis-a-vis the United States, or that enhance our resiliency, right? Or find creative ways of tying files that are of crucial importance in a way that bundle them together to advance interests, right? For example, talking about energy and agriculture at the same time, right? The Chinese are buying more and more Canadian energy, and now we're in this kind of like tit for tat on agriculture and EVs. Maybe there's a way of kind of like bundling some of those together in a way that advances all of our interests, right? So I think there's a little bit more homework to be done there. And also probably the need to lay a little bit more diplomatic groundwork. When it comes to high-level meetings with the Chinese, yes, it's the personalities and the relationship, for example, between Prime Minister Carney and President Xi eventually is going to be very important. But on the Chinese side, generally, there needs to be a lot of preparatory work before you have those types of meetings, so that the leaders don't like unexpected surprises. They like to prepare. And so having a few more ministerial visits, maybe by the trade minister and the foreign minister first, might be desirable. The other thing is not necessarily shy away from criticizing China in areas that we dislike, but actually letting them know what those areas are, and actually having forceful rhetoric, not only publicly but privately in advance. I think will then also kind of help do that. So So I would not necessarily go for a meeting right away. Although perhaps in the context of a multilateral meeting, if there was a G20 event
Right.
or an APEC event, right? Maybe a quick pull aside, hi, great to see you. I've got some issues I need to talk to you about. Maybe, signal a few things in the course of 5 minutes, but a full on bilateral, I think it's a bit early.
Now, Premier Mo and Parliamentary Secretary for the Prime Minister, Cody Blois, on their way back from China.
Yep.
Does that fall under that same critique, or is it a different kind of meeting because they're not actually trying to meet with President Xi?
Well, it's interesting that the initiative was taken by a provincial premier, right? And so I think that one aspect of that, clearly Premier Mo is really trying to do his part to help resolve the canola issue. But I can't help but think that part of his travel to China is actually its objective is not only to meet with Chinese officials, but it's to send a strong signal to Ottawa. It's a domestic political move as well, right? To say, look, as you try to figure out a way to protect Canadian industrial interests in central Canada, including the automotive industry, which is crucial, you can't forget that canola is important, that Western farmers are being affected by this, et cetera, right? So there's a domestic political angle to that. And it's rather unusual for a trade file to be led by a provincial premier on the advocacy side, right? So the fact that at the end of the day, the Prime Minister chose to send his parliamentary secretary, I think, is significant. It probably means that the meetings were probably held at a slightly more higher level as well in Beijing, because the Beijing will not want to really be dealing with the province; it wants to deal with the federal government, right? And I think the broader context that surrounds it is interesting too. I try to follow China news more closely than most. There's a lot of news for all of us to follow these days, but I did pay attention. Prime Minister Carney gave a press availability just earlier this week in the margins of the cabinet planning meetings that he had in Toronto. Mm-hmm. Most of it was about domestic issues, but there were a couple minutes on Russia, China, this meeting indeed that I was talking about that occurred in Beijing, where all the Shanghai Cooperation Organization guys were, and I thought that the wording the Prime Minister chose was very interesting, right? Because basically he said, look, there are issues of concern with China. But clearly, they're not of the same order of magnitude as they are with Russia, for example, or North Korea, because what he says, North Korea, Russia, we're not interested in trading with those countries at all, right? China, we have differences, but they're our second largest trading partner. They're very strong in some areas. There's lots of complementarity, and we should take a look at engaging with them in areas that make sense for Canada. Now, that's you could say that's just, standard kind of rhetoric, but actually I think it's quite significant given where we've been on China in the last few years in terms of public pronouncements from our political leaders. So my sense is that actually the Prime Minister is trying to lay the groundwork for a little bit more engagement with China. And does that mean, a quick resolution of some of these issues we're talking about? Maybe, maybe not, but certainly trying to prepare Canadian public opinion for the fact that if we can't get anywhere with Washington in the near to medium term, we're going to have to become more pragmatic when it comes to dealing with China. And if that's the case, then it does mean finding creative ways to resolve some of these bilateral irritants. Right?
I think we can say that President Trump views Prime Minister Carney differently than Prime Minister Trudeau. There's been a change in that interaction. How does China or President Xi, Chinese officials, how do they view Prime Minister Carney versus Prime Minister Trudeau? They view it the same or different?
Well, it's still early days, but I would, I can't. I'm not in the secrets of what's happening in the Chinese leadership's circles, but. Generally speaking, I think there's probably a sense of relief that the Conservatives didn't win the election, although they could have dealt with the Conservatives. We've talked about that last time. I think there's probably also a sense of relief that they are likely working with someone who's more pragmatic and who's going to be looking to areas where there's either common benefit or try to work on the difficult files together, but there's not going to be doing as much of the kind of like the public signaling about it, and probably going to do a little bit more of that work behind the scenes, which is a style that the Chinese are more comfortable with. We can all decide which approach is better, but certainly from an ability to have like deeper, longer conversations, substantive ones, even on the difficult issues,
Yeah.
that might be a positive. So I think they're looking forward to re-engaging. But as I mentioned earlier, they're also signaling that they're not going to wait for us to sort out our problems with Washington before we have to deal with them as well. And that's where I guess the canola issue is such a tempting one for them to double down on, because, well, A, we've seen that movie before. B, it's an area of critical importance to, a very distinct region of Canada. C, the timing is devastating in the sense that it's close to harvest time, et cetera. And D, I think, is the added bonus. It's actually creating a bit of a national unity issue, right? Because now you're seeing these voices in the West that are framing this as almost an either or between protecting the automotive industry or protecting the canola industry. So that all of that is just going to put a lot more pressure on Ottawa to try to find a way to move out of this quagmire.
When we come back on RealAg Radio, we'll finish up our discussion with Philippe Rheault from the University of Alberta right after this.
Season 4 of the Dirt Podcast is here, and we've got a lot to talk about. From soil fertility to market outlooks, join me and a variety of industry experts as we dig into topics that will help you make better business decisions on your farm. This season, we're also introducing an Ask an Agronomist segment where we'll be answering some of your biggest questions and having some fun along the way. Listen to The Dirt on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or visit nutrient-economics.com.
It's summertime, and you've got a lot of important decisions to make when it comes to your corn crop. Let the Corn School on RealAgriculture.com help guide you through those big decisions with input from leading experts in the field. If it's spray timing, disease identification, or any other field issue, the Corn School's got you covered. The Corn School on RealAgriculture.com, brought to you by BASF and Pride Seeds.
You've always farmed smart. What if you had more insight? Your co-op grow team member can help you collect, analyze, and interpret data so you can make the best decisions for your farm. Plan for success in 2026. Talk to your co-op grow team member today. Let's finish up our conversation with Philippe Rheault. He is the director of the China Institute at the University of Alberta. Economically, though, wouldn't it be a massive risk for the Canadian government to say, we're not sure if we trust DC, we can trust Beijing more? It's not an even trading partner. Let's just even assume it was. That would be a major shift in the way that Canada does business, wouldn't it?
Yeah, and I don't think anyone is arguing for that, right? I don't think it's about trusting Beijing more than trusting the United States. And indeed, as we were mentioning a bit earlier, I think this is the crux of the conundrum for Canada. Is like we have a deep security relationship with the Americans. We have an incredibly strong and important trading relationship with the Americans, and then everything else. Right. Like, for example, I was having a conversation last week with some academics and policymakers from Australia. We were trying to see whether there may be some lessons from the Australia experience that we could learn from as Canadians, because you may recall the Australians had their turn in the doghouse.
Canola, barley, wine, yeah.
Yeah, and now they're out of the doghouse. Things are going a bit better, and we're kind of wondering, what can we learn? And yeah, there's some common areas there we can learn from each other, but there's also some fundamental differences that actually highlight how challenging this is going to be for Canada. So in the case of Australia, for example, their security partnerships are mostly with the United States and with other Western countries.
The Five Eyes, right? Is that
Yeah, but also things like the AUKUS, right? So Australia, UK, US on the nuclear submarines and some other kind of security architecture, and then the Quad and things like that. So mostly Western aligned, right? With the US as the main vector. But their commercial relationships is far more aligned with Asia, right? So for example, believe it or not, so the Australians export, we'll use US dollars to keep it simple. In 24, they exported 200 billion USD to China, and they exported 100 billion USD to the United States. And on top of that, they have a trade surplus with China and a trade deficit with the Americans, right? So for them, like the trade equation is not complicated. They have to trade with China, and they care about values, they care about foreign interference, they care about building resilience, but those are issues that they have to do in tandem, in parallel, right? And it doesn't really affect their security relationships either, right? But when it comes to Canada, right? So we export roughly in 24, we exported roughly 500 billion USD to the United States and 20 billion to China, right? So, and on top of that, we have a roughly balanced trade with the United States, notwithstanding President Trump's view, but with China, we have a massive trade deficit, right? And so our security vectors and our trade vectors are overwhelmingly aligned towards Washington. So anything we consider that actually doesn't go in that direction, we definitely have to be very careful about calculating what kind of impact that's going to have. Now, that being said, again, I can't read all of the tea leaves coming out of Ottawa either, but my sense is that it's been very difficult talks between Ottawa and Washington recently, and that basically every time the new clerk of the Privy Council or Minister LeBlanc go to try to continue the conversation, all they get in return is new demands and no concessions on the American side, right? So based with that dynamic, we're going to have to pivot somewhere, but at the same time, we're going to have to be mindful of what type of impact that might have on our talks with the Americans. But if the Americans then continue to basically offer nothing in those talks, well, at some point, I think it's going to be necessary for Canada to chart out its own path, right? Now, that brings us back to my earlier comments, right? So it's not about choosing China over the U.S. or trusting China more than the United States. It's really about taking a close look at where Canada's strengths are, and can we double down on those, right? Can we create optionality in our trading relationship with the United States vis-a-vis more engagement with China? Energy is a good example. So TMX went online last year, a year and a half ago. The main purchaser of Alberta oil going to the Pacific is China. We're close to half a million barrels a day now, and it's probably going to keep going up. That's a significant number. It's actually positioning us as, believe it or not, China's second largest supplier of crude oil. Oh, no, sorry, I won't put it that way. It puts us right behind Russia in terms of supply of oil to China, right? So we become a significant supplier of oil to China. But maybe more importantly to the point at hand is that even though we ship most of the oil we ship to the United States is shipped by land, the fact that we're now shipping some to China has meant that the price that we're getting for our oil, including the oil that's going overland, has gone up. Right?
Yes.
Right. So look, energy is something China needs. It's actually keen to diversify its sources of supply. It's a critical national security issue for them. So for us to sell oil to China doesn't really create a relationship of dependency vis-a-vis China, right? But it actually gives us optionality vis-a-vis the United States, right? So I'd say energy is a good example of how we might want to take a look at how we can enhance those kinds of things, right? And then, in agriculture, maybe it's a bit trickier. And you're the expert on that, Shaun, but, should we be taking a look at more added value in Canada so that the product we're selling is a bit different, whether it's oils instead of seed? A colleague of mine, again, and now I'm venturing on very uncertain terrain, but a colleague of mine was mentioning, for example, how, inflation, one of the main causes of food inflation in the West is the cost of the equipment. Well, the Chinese ag equipment is actually apparently of decent quality now. Like, I don't know if we want to do that kind of devil's bargain, but is there a way to play on tariffs by coming up with a deal where we're getting decent quality equipment at 1/10 of the price that helps us on inflation, but then also helps us on tariff. I don't know. So I'm just trying creative ways of focusing on our strengths and creating optionality for us that advances our interests. I think that's where we need to be looking going forward, right? And, the government is talking about infrastructure projects. It's talking about resilience. It's talking about defense. But I think trade policy is going to be a key component of that as well.
What is, at this stage here in 2025, what's one of the big misunderstandings about whether it's the economics or the political climate right now in China?
Certainly, I think since COVID, the lack of interaction between the West and China has done us a disservice because we're not able as easily to get a sense of the incredible pace of change that's going on in China. Maybe I'll mention two things, right? And again, this is from the perspective of someone who's constantly thinking about how we can advance Canadian interests, right? But in a very rapidly changing international context, right? The first one is we need to realize that not in every area, but in some areas, China is actually now the tech leader, right? And so we tend to believe that, the West is basically, the hotbed of innovation. The Chinese are maybe good at copying or adapting or incrementally kind of improving products and then making them more competitive in the market. But actually in some areas of hard science, in areas like electric vehicles, et cetera, the Chinese are light years ahead of the West, right? So maybe we need to revise our own playbook, right? Again, it's about being proactive instead of being reactive. Maybe we need to consider, for example, welcoming Chinese investment in areas where their tech is better than ours, right? But the quid pro quo is if they want our market access, they need to transfer some of their technology to us, right? That's what they used to do to us 20 years ago.
Right, yes.
We think about doing that ourselves now, right? That's one area. Maybe a more broader kind of, this might sound a bit abstract, but I think it's important. You're saying what do Canadians need to know or need to kind of maybe realize a bit more about China? And that's that, when we're in the West, we have a tendency to still view the world through kind of like the lens of North Americans and Western Europeans, right? But when you travel to the rest of the world, actually, you realize that narrative is not making as much headway as it used to, right? And so, the global South, its view of China, some parts of South Asia and Southeast Asia, their views of China, they don't love China, but they're more than willing to be transactional with China. And they are increasingly viewing the United States as an unreliable, unpredictable partner that is forcing them to take a second look at China. And that second look is not as negative as you might think, right? So the entire kind of global architecture is shifting. And so we need to react to that. We need to adapt to that. And I think we need to, as middle powers like Canada, we need to kind of work very hard with like-minded and maybe even not so like-minded middle countries like Japan, like Australia, maybe the Indonesias of this world, the Indias, to make sure that as the US and China jockey for kind of leadership in terms of setting international norms, well, that they don't get to do it all by themselves and that we actually have a voice to try to maintain some of the architecture that advances our interests.
We've talked a lot about China relation with the US, with Canada. You've mentioned Europe. Mexico has been not mentioned once. Where do they fit in this whole discussion?
Well, that's a really good question. I'm kind of thinking about it in real time. I think we need to think more about Mexico because in a Fortress North America scenario, which is still not completely off the table, then Mexico brings many assets that would allow that North American economic entity to really thrive. Right? It's got that complement to what Canada and the United States has. Right? But on the other hand, to the extent that doesn't seem to be the trajectory, at least in the short term, Mexico has got its own challenges because it's not necessarily that well equipped to compete with China, right? How we deal with Mexico is going to be interesting.
You've mentioned Fortress North America a couple times. I want to maybe finish there. What are your thoughts on that concept? Premier Ford talks about it all the time. from Ontario. I've written about it a little bit to try to explain to the audience or what's at work and as it in this whole, Canada trying to make some decisions and some of the consequences of possible decisions, and I'm trying to unwind this a little bit to simplify it for people. What is your thought on Fortress North America and that concept?
Well, I guess it would require for whether or not it's the ideal way to organize the North American economy. I think it for it to work, it needs to have as the common kind of underpinning one word, which is trust, right? Mutual trust. I think that is currently in short supply, and I don't see how a Canadian leader or a Mexican leader can put all their eggs into the Fortress North America basket at this moment in time, given how truculent, impetuous, and unpredictable the United States has proven to be in the recent past, right? So by definition, we're kind of in a difficult situation there. At a broader philosophical level, then everyone is entitled to their opinion. My sense is that we have so many assets to bring to the table as a North American economic entity that actually our best path towards prosperity is in an open international trading system, not one in which we retrench, and where our ideas, our innovative capacity, our natural resources, our rule of law, our transparency, our forms of government are actually used to help us lead by example, and not necessarily by proselytizing or imposing our will, but just by success breeds a lot of imitation. And I think that that's what we've had in the past. And to kind of pull away from that now, I think it might be a function of various domestic political forces, but it's probably not the best way to go. But that would just be my personal view.
Philip, really appreciate you shedding light on this. I appreciate your expertise and your amount of study on the topic of China. Of course, as the director of the China Institute at the University of Alberta. Thank you so much for joining us here today. Appreciate it.
I appreciate the questions. Thank you.
Great conversation there with Philippe Rheault, who is the director of the China Institute at the University of Alberta. Appreciated him really giving us a lot of time here. He is a busy man. There's a lot happening when it comes to the topic of China right now. Hopefully that sheds some light. I think there's things that, depending on where you sit on the spectrum of China hawkishness, if there is such a spectrum, some of you probably are going to push back on some of the things that he said, and some of you are probably going to, if you're a little bit softer on China policy, you're going to say, hey, you know what, this may be, I really want to work with this and build on this and even go even further. So I think it was a really good perspective because he has such insight and such knowledge when it comes to China policy, and appreciate him joining us here today because there's no right answers. It's just trying to find the best path at this point, it does seem. And I know this is a very sensitive subject for many of you in the world of agriculture, and hopefully there was stuff to pull out of that and learn and have a little bit of a deeper understanding of some of the challenges the Carney government is under. Now, if you have any feedback, we'd love to hear from you. Send me that email, shaney@realagriculture.com. You can also call the Real Ag feedback line, 855-776-6147. And of course, you can find Real Agriculture across all the different social media platforms. Encourage you to do so. And of course, for the rest of the week, actually, Lindsay Smith, she's got the wheel. She's got this seat. She'll be your host. And I'll talk to you again next week. Thanks so much, everybody, for getting real and getting connected with Real Ag Radio. Cheers, everybody.